Welcome to the OBR Streaming Network for a brand new edition of Things I Think I Know About the Cleveland Browns here in the early going of the offseason. Some would call it silly season, lots of rumors, lots of things to discuss as the Browns try to bounce back from their disappointing season and get ready for the 2025 season. We've got draft stuff, we've got free agency on the horizon. So get over to the OBR.com where there's tons of content all the time. My esteemed panel tonight is Pete Smith and, of course, Abby Mueller. What's going on, guys? You guys doing well?
Doing good. I feel like peak silly season, like you said, is in full swing. We had a Denzel Ward TMZ clip today, so we're just, it's going full silly season right now.
Yeah, there you go. I missed that. What was the TMZ clip with Denzel?
Some reporter was just asking him like what he thinks about the Browns and this offseason, and he was just like, "Yeah, got to figure out quarterback." And then the reporter also called Miles Garrett Miles. So that was just an interesting moment too. But yeah, it was just asking him, generic Browns questions to see if he could say anything crazy
on TMZ. Cool. Gotta love that. All right. So there was an article this week that came out in The Athletic. Jason Lloyd authored it with help from others. This was something when Jason talked about it, he said basically they started collecting quotes and getting ready for this article a while back, knowing that it would come kind of at the end of the Watson era in Cleveland. And at the news that he had re-ruptured his Achilles, they said that waiting for this to play out, it would be not as relevant as it would now. So they went ahead and posted it. In it are some interesting quotes, some interesting information, which I thought we should talk about tonight and get our what we think about this stuff. So let's dive right in here. So in the article, here is a quote from a player, I believe. You have to bring Joe back. Somebody has to teach Deshaun the offense, one member of the organization said, as the season neared its conclusion, obviously the end of the 23 season. Joe picked it up faster in 30 days than Deshaun has in 2 years. Quite the quote about Deshaun and, Flacco picking it up in 30 days. Quote supposedly coming from a member of the organization. Obviously, they didn't bring Joe back. Not that really makes a difference in this season at all. This is more about Deshaun, I guess. The first thing I think of is like where did his ability to, the guy that I watched in press conferences in Houston, diagnosing defenses and looking very smart about the game of football, where did that guy go? They're painting him in this light that he can't grasp this offense. Abby, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the first part of that on like someone has to teach Deshaun the offense, like I kind of agree with you that like I don't think bringing Joe back was necessarily going to change anything in that perspective. Like I don't think Joe has also been known to say about, helping other quarterbacks on the team. That's not really his jam. He's kind of there to do a job and, kind of respects that. So I don't know if I have any major takeaways from that first part, but the second part I think is the really important part of just like Deshaun's lack of ability to pick up this offense at any point. I mean, he's been here for a number of years now, and obviously they've changed the offense throughout that time. It hasn't stayed consistent, but to have the other players on the team feel that way, and who knows when this exact quote came from. It could have come from, much earlier in the season. I don't know. But it's definitely concerning that that's how the players were feeling. And I think it makes it even more clear that the buy-in from early on this season just wasn't there. They kind of knew it in training camp. They kind of knew it early on that like the offense wasn't going in the direction they had hoped. And I think that's become more clear, especially through a lot of this.
Yeah. Pete?
Just comes down to a question of incapable or uninterested. And I know that Deshaun was not keen on taking advice from Jameis Winston. So that is obviously not helpful. And then, I've maintained all along this year that he's still in 2020. The game has evolved and he hasn't. And whether that came to a point where he just basically stopped trying, or if that's a case of sort of resigned to his fate, I don't know the answer, but obviously neither is painting him in anything other than a just terrible light. So, I mean, that's sort of where you're at.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, that we hear this now, but I mean, what good does it do at this point? And kind of, okay, great. I mean, it explains some of what we saw, I guess. But I think that's well said, Pete. Incapable of doing it, or just not interested. I don't think it's incapable, personally, but
yeah,
that's just my thought on it.
Do you know how much that quote is going to feed the people who wanted Joe Flacco back more than anything? Like, they're going to hold on to these two quotes here for the rest of time. They're like,
he's available.
He should have been back.
It makes no difference, though. Like, I mean,
no.
Joe Flacco would have made zero difference
Absolutely
this
not.
year.
But it'll make people feel like they were right. So
sure, okay, they can have it, I guess. All right, so we'll go to the second one here. I've spoken to players who believe Callahan would have stayed had Van Pelt remained on staff. Noted glue guy. When Brian first started receiving head coaching, Brian Callahan, Bill's son, started receiving coaching interviews in 2023. Bill made it clear that he was staying in Cleveland, but all of that seemed to change when Van Pelt was fired. Andy Dickerson was brought in. I can't see the rest of that, but sorry. Andy Dickerson was brought in, and if you can read the rest of that.
It says Andy Dickerson was hired to replace Callahan. The changes were a disaster.
There you go. So, I mean, I don't know if I believe this. I feel like Bill was going to go no matter what when Brian got a head coaching job. I would be. I mean, this is surprising to me to even try to paint in a light that Van Pelt somehow would have had an influence on. I didn't know they were that close, but I wouldn't know. How would we know? I don't know. He was supposedly the glue guy. What do you think, Abby?
I don't know how much I feel like Bill still being around would have changed the offensive line play this year regardless. Like, I do always think that was made to be a bigger factor than it was. I mean, maybe the Andy Dickerson piece of it was more of the worst piece, that like they didn't bring in someone that worked, for that role. But I don't think necessarily like Bill being gone was the reason everything went so poorly for the offensive line this year. I think there were so many factors to it, and it's kind of easy to just scapegoat it as the coach being an issue. But I'm kind of with you on like, I find it strange that the Van Pelt thing is such a big factor. He worked obviously he was an offensive coordinator, but wasn't calling plays. I think worked really closely with the quarterbacks. I would be surprised that, his role as the offensive line coach, he was like, I don't want to do it anymore because AVP is not here. That just doesn't really make sense to me, but you never know what's going on behind the scenes in these locker rooms.
not enough information really there. Pete, what do you think of this?
I don't think that's what it says. I mean, straight up, the way it's written. They're trying to get you to jump to that conclusion. All of that seemed to change when Van Pelt was fired, so you have no idea. He's leading you to believe that that's the change that made a difference, and maybe it was part of it. Maybe there are a number of factors, but it literally doesn't say what I've seen any number of people throw out there on Twitter that Van Pelt is the reason that Dickerson or that Callahan left. The piece isn't claiming that. It's leading you to sort of try to make that connection.
Well, it's alluding to that.
Yes, which maybe, but like there's a lot of things that changed. There's a lot of things that could have played into that. The fact that they're changing the offense entirely, the fact that they just the direction things were going with Deshaun could have been problematic. He could have seen the writing on the wall. Brian Callahan could have been, put more pressure on him to come coach with him. There's any number of factors, but to me, I think you're just being led to sort of draw the conclusion that Van Pelt was that, or maybe Van Pelt was the last straw. I don't know the answer to that, but ultimately, Bill Callahan's a legend. He's one of the best to do it. Him and Jeff Stoutland. But having said that, the Browns were going to have to cross this bridge. And clearly it's not Andy Dickerson. You're hoping it's Mike Bloomgren. So it's unfortunate that this is the path that they had to go down to get there. But if Mike Bloomgren can do the job, that's fine. Bill Callahan is not going to coach until he's 80. So at some point, the Browns are going to have to figure this part out.
Yeah, I think you make a good point that it doesn't come flat out and say it. It's alluding to the possibility of that being a factor. But I think it could be just as simple as he wanted to go coach with his son. I mean, they're making it seem like there was some big change, but I guess we don't really know that.
I can tell you that there was, early on in the process, the thought was that he was going to stay in Cleveland. Right. That was definitely a thing. And then it did change. Now, what caused the change? I'm not sure we know the answer. But like I said, this doesn't give you conclusive anything. It's just sort of Van Pelt may be the tipping point. Who knows?
Yeah. Is it possible in the process, like after they knew that Brian was going to get the head coaching job, it sounded like he was going to stay? I don't remember.
No, I mean, when Brian had the job initially, it sounded like Bill's going to stay here and then change his mind ultimately. So something changes. It's just a question of what it was.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, it could have been Brian just asking him to come.
Yeah.
Could be.
Right. Couldn't say no to his son.
Yeah. I mean, interesting stuff though. All right. We'll go to slide 3. This one is one that I found very interesting. According to multiple players, those mistakes, referring to Deshaun's, weren't pointed out in film sessions, frustrating at least a few veterans who believe Stefanski wouldn't criticize Watson in front of the team. When Jameis Winston replaced Watson after he tore his Achilles in October, players said Stefanski returned to pointing out his mistakes. So in film sessions. This is interesting. People have taken this and run with what, I mean, people are certainly taking liberties with this part of the article that I have heard on the radio. I mean, just running rampant with speculation here, just kind of almost to the point where they're just creating stories out of the ether or nothing, you know what I mean? Just to make up, that Stefanski, this, that, the other. I don't know what to think of it other than, I think Quincy said in Slack that, if you're dealing with a quarterback with, confidence issues, maybe pointing this out. I mean, you don't handle every player the same, right? You should handle them all fairly, but you don't handle them the same. So pointing this stuff out to Watson when he's having confidence issues may have not been the best approach by Stefanski. Maybe it's something he chose to do behind closed doors. The only issue I'd have is if he wasn't pointing them out at all. So, thoughts, Abby?
No, I'm with you. I feel like these things could have been happening in a different setting. I think Stefanski was in a very tough position this season. A lot of pressure on making it work with Watson. And clearly Watson has kind of been, sensitive to all kinds of criticisms over the last few years. So I'm sure he was super aware of that and was doing everything he could to get the most out of him on the field. And if that means, having to give him some of that feedback privately, like I'm sure he was willing to do that. But at the same time, I can understand from the perspective of the rest of the team in that locker room, you're not winning football games. It's pretty obvious a huge part of why that's happening. And to sit there and, not hear the reasons being called out, like I can get why they would feel that frustration, especially seeing in contrast later, if those things were being called out for Jameis, like I can get why
Yeah.
that would kind of spiral into a bigger thing for all of them. So I can see both perspectives on, why everyone felt the way they did.
Yeah, I think that you make a good point, and the question is there like a double standard here, right? And I think veterans would maybe understand a little bit more, like, hey, what's going on? Whereas maybe some younger players might not get it, right? Like, hey, how important it is that our quarterback is in the right headspace. What do you think, Pete?
Well, famously, Paul Brown yelled at Bobby Mitchell to yell at Jim Brown. It's a cute story where this one is not. Look, it comes across to me as, in connection with some other things, Deshaun couldn't take coaching and couldn't take tough coaching. And in connection with not being willing to listen to his own teammates like Jameis Winston, it sounded like if you criticized him, he was just going to basically fold, which is awful. I mean, you want to be able to coach guys hard. You want them to be able to sort of handle that type of coaching. The fact that they didn't think they could is indicative of what we saw in the field. That, there's this element of walking on eggshells with Watson and then going out there and watching him play terribly. Whereas Winston, even though Winston has had some issues with, emotional highs and lows where he's really, really good when he's, feeling it in terms of like how he is with teammates and all those other things. He also has a habit of also, the valleys go pretty deep as well. But clearly he could take coaching that Watson could not. And that's it sends a bad message to the rest of your locker room. And I could see why it's not difficult to see why players would sort of, at the very least, take note, but probably resentful in the end of the guy not being able to be called out.
Does it say anything about Stefanski that we didn't know before? Or is it was this just forced upon him by Watson's inability to take any coaching?
I think it comes down to he was trying to make the best of a horrific situation.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what you allow yourself to do. This is why we're hearing so much of Kevin Stefanski's going to take back his offense, this, that, and the other, coaching for everybody, not just one player on offense, those type of things. I think there's a lot of that where, I think they self-inflicted, put themselves into a situation where they forced themselves to have to sort of work through this. And that's not a good situation for anybody. And clearly why, there was this element of when Watson left the building, that it felt like a dark cloud was lifted off the organization. And I had people arguing, why don't the Browns, why is it okay for the Browns to let him go on vacation or whatever? And my response was, they want him the hell away from this team by any way they can get it. They were happy to have him leave.
I do find all of this just knowledge about how the players were feeling a little funny in contrast to the way they were ripping fans with the Deshaun cheering for the injury thing. And look, I get why they had to say what they said publicly, but it is funny knowing how they were feeling personally behind the scenes and still obviously have to defend their teammate. But the contrast is entertaining.
It's wild. Yeah. What a mess all around. Wild stuff. All right. You're watching things I think I know about the Browns. with Pete Smith, Abby Mueller. My name is Brad Ward. Hit like and subscribe. This is the OBR streaming network. As we are perusing parts of the Athletics article on Deshaun Watson this week. All right, let's go to the fourth slide here. Off the field, Watson spent a year dealing with traumatic personal matters. His agent, David Mulugeta, received a disturbing email in June from someone threatening to shoot Watson or burn down his house, according to the police report obtained by The Athletic. Police later, you got that, Abby?
Police later closed the investigation with no suspects identified.
There we go. He was receiving death threats. How common of a thing do we think this is? I mean, the police were involved, so they obviously took it seriously enough here. I mean, what do we do with this information?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, in the unfortunate reality of like social media and everything today, like I think this is the reality for a lot of public figures, even people who haven't had, intense personal matters like Deshaun has had. Like a kicker missing a field goal at the end of the game sometimes is going to have people giving the same type of threats, which is just an unfortunate reality. I think like the bigger picture for this for me is how much the Browns severely underestimated the mental toll that all of this was going to take on a person. And, regardless of how you feel about him, like it was going to affect him personally on the field, mentally, everything, the way people were going to react to it. And it's still a little crazy to me that I don't think the Browns thought that through when making the choice to bring him in, that like, wow, he might never be able to get over this situation and, the amount of criticism that he's going to be receiving for it.
Yeah, it's not. It's interesting. It's not that I don't know if they didn't think it through, but it was certainly they gambled on it, right?
Yeah, right.
And I guess they gambled that he was mentally strong enough to handle it. Now, there are other things in this article too. Like I think before this part, they talk about more personal matters where he lost his dad, right? And then his friend as well, or another family member, right, in the same time frame before in the off season, right, last off season. So, there was a lot going on. There was another person came forward with another allegation last off season. So, you wonder what his attitude was coming into the season. Now, me and Pete watched on the React, every week his podcast where he seemed to be in good spirits all summer long. So I don't know. It's interesting. What do you think, Pete?
Well, I think it's extremely common, but it's usually related to betting. Where, people are upset that player X did something or coach Y, made a decision that affected their bottom line. This is a different bucket. It still happens, unfortunately. I mean, it's not okay for any of this to happen, but this element with Watson and what he represented, what he was accused of, everything that came with it. Listen, I said it at the time. One, I think the Browns thought Watson was going to just play well enough that it was going to cover for a lot of this. But even in the moment, I mean, I knew people immediately who were just done with the Browns. And people who didn't want to be done with the Browns, but like it just changed the relationship with the team. Or somebody likely in this scenario took it so hard that they went this route. So unfortunately it happens. And even in the sort of Watson bucket where it's based on accusations or actions that they've taken off the field, it's still going to happen. But, that doesn't make it acceptable or make it like, the money doesn't make Watson immune. Having said that, that contract, the draft picks and everything else, put a level of pressure on him that, he had to sort of recognize was coming. And that's sort of where you get into a spot where like, there's a part of you on a human level where you're empathetic to his plight in this situation, but you're also sitting there going $230 million, no matter what you do, you can figure it out. And there's a line that obviously can't be crossed, but it doesn't surprise me. Does that square with everything else that happened with him? I don't think so. But there is a human component with all this stuff. For example, one of the 49ers corners used to play for the Chiefs, whose name escapes me right now. I believe he's going to be a free agent this year, and he's basically told the 49ers he's not going to resign there because he and his wife had a child and lost the child, and being in California or San Francisco or whatever just is too hard for them, so they want to sign somewhere else and start anew and try to get a fresh start and all that stuff. That's just too painful. That is a real thing anyone can sort of empathize with. But Watson just made it so difficult because he partly just, I guess, who he is, but also just the way he carries himself.
Yeah.
I've said in the moment, the most human he ever appeared was when he was on the field with the Achilles.
Yeah.
When it had ruptured, that was the moment where you saw the most humanity from him. You saw the entire way. Everything else was trying to put up this shield that he wasn't affected, that he was sort of bulletproof and all these other things. And I've said all along, I thought that hurt him in some ways. In the same way that, let's use Andrew Berry as an example. I wrote an article ahead of his press conference saying, you have to address this trade as a failure. You just have to. You can't insult the intelligence of fans by pretending it's not. And part of that was he needed to do that just to stop pretending it wasn't a thing and take the issue off the table. But also because if he was willing to sort of put himself out there and be human, there were always going to be a percentage of people who are never going to forgive him and will always want to be him fired. But it may be a small percentage of people who are willing to sort of go, I'm willing to see what you can do now. And there is a want from just people in general, but certainly sports fans, to forgive.
Yeah.
And he gave himself that ability to have that, whereas Watson never did that. He always had a way of making the situation feel worse for people.
Yeah. Well said. All right, let's go to the final slide I have here. All right. I think this was alluded to earlier. Players told me there was a constant heaviness surrounding Watson in the locker room, and they felt different energy in the building upon his departure after the Achilles injury, in October. I can't read the rest of it.
A couple of veterans told me it felt like a cloud had been lifted.
It goes to, Pete's energy vampire comment that has carried the day here. This is something that was visible, I think, for some time. And I think when I first started to really notice it was just the lift that Flacco got, the pop that he got when, down the stretch, or even just the way the team rallied around the backups as in 23, and then into this year where you're expecting this Watson to come back from surgery, and something was off from the get-go. Right.
Yeah, that Ravens game when Jameis came out there, it felt like that was a different football team. You could almost feel what this little excerpt is talking about, that it felt like the cloud had been lifted and they were playing more freely in a lot of ways. As much, I think pressure as Watson had in all of this, I think the other players probably took a lot of that on too, just knowing the way people were talking about the Browns and the way people have felt about the organization in general. It would be hard for them not to kind of feel some of that weight as he continues to play poorly, and just knowing how everyone feels about it. So I'm sure in that moment, it felt like a easy game for them to rally around each other, being like, okay, maybe we can move on from this too. And, people will want to respect us as a team again, because there are a lot of people out there, fans and media, who would not talk about the Browns because of the decision that the organization made, which I did find at times like unfair to other players on the team, like a Myles Garrett, who has nothing to do with, that decision being made. But I'm sure some of them, even subtly took that a little bit personally, that, no one wanted to give them as, other players any respect. So yeah, I think we could all see this. This was pretty evident.
Pete?
Knowing that any press conference you might get asked questions about Watson, knowing what you're seeing in practice, what you're seeing in games, and knowing that it's going to be like that, it sucks the life out of you slowly but surely. And again, I even said this in the moment, was that it was easier for the Browns to have him get seriously injured than just benched. Yeah. Because seriously injured in this case meant you could get him out the door, you could get him out of the building. Benched, he was still going to be there, and you were still going to have to deal with it. Now, it still would have been better for, I think the sort of mental health of the team, but getting him out of the building changed everything, because he was the whole focus of everything. And you've seen this with like Amari Cooper sort of taking, I don't even know if they're backhanded, but just sort of not thrilled with, how things ended in Cleveland. And some of that was his own fault with his contract, but just the way that things sort of ended just wasn't good for anybody. And since Watson's been out the building, other than, Myles Garrett being sort of pinned down with 35 different conditions on the possibility of potentially leaving the team, the thing I keep noticing is the players desperately want this to work. They desperately want to, keep this thing going and figure out how to win, because they've done it before. And I find the weirdest part about this whole thing is the players seem to like Stefanski more now than they did before this year, which is a testament to sort of, I guess, him opening up to them in some ways in a losing season, when he was sort of willing to let the players the player relationship sort of run the show, and they were winning. And, I would be very curious to know if there have been sort of some heart-to-heart conversations in terms of coach to players basically saying, listen, this is on me/us as in the organization. We're going to get this right, among other things, that sort of has people feeling better about it. I know that's been sort of alluded to with Myles Garrett and Hard Knocks, although I think that entirely was a product of people trying to run with the crap that people contrived out of the previous one, that he wanted to do that. But nevertheless, it was noticeable that the first thing in Hard Knocks was basically going, Myles Garrett was like, we're closer than people think we are. And Andrew Berry's like, I'm never trading him ever. So, we'll see what happens. But like, obviously this whole thing's just been a giant setback. And part of the reason I'm sort of over it is because, one, this happened in October, and two, no offense to The Athletic, I think they did a great job with this reporting and everything. I already knew about all this stuff. So it's not like new to me that this was happening. So it's not like bombshell information that players didn't want him there, that that everybody was done with him. We already knew this was going to happen. I for whatever reason, people kept teasing this out like the Browns were going to continue to go with this thing, and that was never going to happen.
No way.
Yeah. Interesting thing you said there about Stefanski. I forget who said it. There was a strange quote. I thought it was interesting at the time. think it was a Breer quote about Stefanski, kind of like he does well in extremely challenging situations.
That's
Or
from
like,
the ESPN article. That was all in that article, that he was like
okay.
super focused on, like really enjoys sort of the challenge of being down and out and
Yeah.
rebuilding the thing.
Yeah. Which is a weird way to say it. You might be like, he's good and, under pressure. He's good when things are down. He can get things back. But to be like, you could take it a couple different ways. But to your point of like the conversations that were probably had in the ups and downs of what had to have been a miserable season at times, it appears that he was able to your point, make some connections and learn some things as a head coach.
It's absolutely insane listening to Browns players talk about this team relative to other organizations. Like listening to players talk about the Jets is crazy to me, or the way Giants players were absolutely infuriated that the team was outright tanking, even though they screwed it up. But like, whereas I've never heard an ill word from the Browns, like this would have been really easy. Like we didn't get an article that was ready to go the second the Cavs were out of the playoffs, just crushing JB Bickerstaff. I think JB Bickerstaff is a super underrated coach. I think he's a really good coach. But nevertheless, it's hard to ignore when all these quotes are coming out from players about how they don't like JB for this, that, and the other. And they were a second round playoff team compared to the Browns. Were like, you don't have these things come out. And maybe there will be a point where something will come out. But like that was the night that they lost, that this was ready to go. And you don't have that with the Browns, which is it says something. Now, ultimately, nobody's going to care if this team is 5-12 next year, but it leaves an impression that the players are just like, no, we're going to get this thing figured out, all this other thing. And again, even as the season has played out, I have friends who have basically like, listen, I'm done. I'm done with the Browns. Wake me when they're doing something worthwhile. And yet I find this element of it incredibly endearing from these players. Deshaun Watson was an absolute nightmare, but there are a lot of players on this team I just genuinely like. As people, which is, what you could say about the 23 season. Especially when it was Joe Flacco at quarterback or DTR, and you could you really just enjoyed the people and the national rallying cry where all these people, covering the NFL sort of gave everybody gave everybody the green light. It's okay to cheer for the Browns while they're doing this, is really interesting to me. It's the same thing with 2020 versus 2021. 2020 was one of the most fun teams, of my lifetime, and 2021 was a miserable situation from almost start to finish. So they've got to obviously prove it, but it would be very easy for everybody to come out and go, man, I want to get out of here. I can't wait. Or at the very least be like, we got to get rid of X and Y other than Deshaun Watson. They're not doing that.
Yeah. I'm sure reporters were asking those questions, trying to get those answers out of people. And the fact that they weren't giving them is definitely a big deal. I also think it was a couple weeks ago now when I think it was Conklin, Bentonio, they were kind of talking about Stefanski and just how much they love play. They were the guys that they brought in to play in an offense like Kevin Stefanski's, and that they didn't feel like they were working to their strengths. And I think the fact that they were so earnestly saying these things, I don't know, it made me feel like they're okay, we've talked about this internally on how we feel as players, how Kevin Stefanski feels, and we want to work together to get this in a place where everyone is happy. I think the fact that they were saying that publicly makes me feel like they've been having those vulnerable conversations behind the scenes.
No doubt. Absolutely. Great stuff, guys. Really interesting Hopefully, no more of this Watson stuff for a while, unless we're talking about voiding contracts or potentially insurance money, which I read somewhere could be up to like 44 point.
No, not that. That's not how it works. Otherwise, the NFL would be, or I should say, the salary cap would be a giant scam. So you don't get all the money back. That would be
so. The report about the 44.1 of if he missed all of 25 in 26 is false.
We have no idea what the amount's going to be, but it's not going to be that high. Otherwise, you would just insure all your highest paid players, and then like some amount of them would miss a bunch of time. Like I think Jack said the number is at least 6 games or whatever. Okay, well, if you insured Njoku, if you insured JOK, if you insured basically all these guys you send to extension, the Browns or anyone else, so long as they're willing to pay this money, could just flout the cap to no end.
We will find out the figure hopefully at some point, the exact figure, but they should receive some relief. And certainly they will potentially be looking into a void. I would think, depending on what investigations tell them about what Deshaun was doing when he got hurt, right? So any parting words, guys, before we get out of here? Abby?
I'm actually feeling excited about this offseason for the first time in a little bit. I think it's fun to be a part of the draft again and to be like in a real way, not in a third round way. And I don't know, it feels like everything's been put out there and it's time to build back, and I'm feeling optimistic about it. So maybe that's just me, but
oh yeah. Pete?
Look, it's all there for them in terms of draft picks and talent that already exists on the roster if they can get healthy. Like DeJuan Jones says he's out of his walking boot next week, which is obviously good for him. So, look, if they can pay off the offseason in terms of free agency and do some good things there, if they can make the draft count, if they can set themselves up and Kevin Stefanski sort of gets his groove back in the way that sounds like he is, combine all that with the fact that they could have easily won more games if they just played Jameis the whole time or any number of other factors. I think they're closer to a 500 team now than many people want to believe. And then if they do some good things, that they're right back in the playoff, mix one way or the other.
You said it, man. Let's hope so. They need a good offseason and some stuff to fall into place, but it should be fun to cover and keep it locked at the OBR where everything is there for you. 24/7 coverage of all the goings on, and make sure you subscribe, become an insider. You'll know things going on days and weeks in advance. I promise you, they're killing it as over there. So thank you, Pete. Thank you, Abby. For Pete and for Abby, my name is Brad Ward. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks for watching.